All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the program Missouri Turkey Calls and the artists behind them. My name is Brian Flowers with the Missouri Department of Conservation, Regional Supervisor in the Central and Northeast regions. And I want to thank you for joining us. Hopefully you'll get some information out of this program. Hopefully it will encourage you to go out and give turkey hunting a try or uh, pick up some turkey calls of your own. My guest is Tony, or my guest host is Tony Hancock, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Brian. I'm glad to be on here tonight and be a part of this. As Brian said, my name is Tony Hancock. I grew up down in the Ozarks, currently live in Jeff City, Missouri, and I am a market reporter / analyst for the Missouri Department of Agriculture.
So the goal of our program tonight is to talk turkey calls and turkey hunting in Missouri. We'll talk a little bit about turkeys in Missouri and turkeys in North America, different subspecies to begin with, the restoration effort of the wild turkey in our state. And then we'll start to get into some history about turkey calling and turkey calls. And then we want to examine both the current call makers in our state and our historic call makers in Missouri, in particular down in the South Central Ozarks. And we'll touch on turkey calls and turkey call makers from all over Missouri. So one of the first things we want to get started with is we both have been involved in mentoring youth and mentoring new hunters into turkey hunting. That's something we both like to do. And our partnership and mentoring goes back a few years, doesn't it?
It does. It goes back quite a while.
We'll travel about anywhere to take somebody turkey hunting, and it's something we've enjoyed over the years and continue to do it today. Tony has some young daughters, and I know he's getting those kids into turkey hunting too. So
yeah, not only turkey hunting, we've got a lot of experience with waterfowl, deer,
right.
doves. I mean, we've done about all of it.
Right. So wouldn't want to start without talking about our first turkey experience, and I'll let you explain yours. I always like to hear good turkey stories. So
sure. That picture there, 1986, that was when I killed my first turkey. Now that is not my first turkey. I was a few years older than what that picture is. But unfortunately my first turkey doesn't have the perfect storybook story to it. You know, we all dream about walking in the woods and find that turkey on the roost and setting up and hearing it gobble and it flying right down to your decoy and shooting it. Well, my story isn't quite that exciting. My first turkey hunt, I can remember it was on a Sunday morning. I was hunting with my grandpa, who was my mentor, got me in the outdoors and pretty much involved in everything I do. But it was a Sunday morning, so of course, being from South Central Missouri, we had to get back, and we couldn't miss church on Sunday morning, so we didn't have a lot of time. But we'd been out in the woods and hadn't had a whole lot of luck, and we were kind of way back on my great grandfather's farm on the Ruby Dew down there, and kind of as we were coming out, we found a turkey out in the hayfield, and Grandpa, knowing the land, knowing what the turkeys were going to do, we kind of pulled a sneak and went way around that field and kind of set up on a road, knowing he was going to go there. And sure enough, he did. And we more or less ambushed that turkey. And that was kind of my first turkey. So yeah. They don't always happen storybook.
Right. That's right. And certainly my story is one of those. And the purpose of this program is to talk about turkey calls and turkey calling. But my first turkey harvest didn't even involve making a call. I had scouted out a field on a private landowner I was hunting on and set up on the field. And it was windy that morning. I sat on the edge of the field. Lo and behold, turkeys had flown into the field. I didn't even see them fly in, and they come strutting by. And I picked out the biggest one and took it. So sure. I think that bird, he was a ridge runner. He only weighed about 16 pounds. He had been yeah. busy up to that time, but he had a big old beard. So that was my first turkey harvest. What some folks might know is Tony and I are from the basic general area of Texas County, South Central Missouri. Went to the same school and grew up hunting roughly about the same time, mid '80s to the mid '90s, and there in Texas County. So we've got a lot of different turkey experiences and turkey hunting stories, I'm sure. We'll start a little bit with the Missouri turkey restoration information. We'd like everybody to know that wild turkeys are a very unique bird, and today in North America, about 6 million wild turkeys in I believe 49 states.
I believe so. Yes, every state but Alaska.
Except Alaska. You could even go to Hawaii and hunt the eastern subspecies, and you could even go to the country of New Zealand and hunt the eastern wild turkey. During 2019, we had about 182,000 hunters that hunted turkeys in Missouri. That's both spring and fall tags. Our approximate population is between 300 and 400,000 birds. We have a very healthy turkey population. I was told once that 1/10 of all wild turkeys on the planet Earth reside in the state of Missouri. And a lot of people come to Missouri to turkey hunt, and Missouri is, of course, known for great hunting and offers a lot of different opportunities in both public land and private land hunting. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, unregulated market hunting, along with habitat destruction, did contribute to the near extinction of the wild turkey across much of its range in North America. By 1952, there was an estimated 2,500 turkeys in only 31 counties across the state. And in that early time, the turkeys existed in those fragmented habitats where there were enough cover and enough habitat that they could just barely hold on. So, of course, restoration efforts improved that over the years. And by 1960, in fact, it was April 27th to the 29th, a 3-day spring season happened in 14 counties in Missouri. And things really started to happen in the 1960s in regards to our turkey flock and interest in turkey hunting. And those of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s certainly benefited from a lot of those things happening during that time, both from turkey management and the work that the biologists were doing, and also Missouri landowners that were improving habitat for wild turkeys. By 1979, the restoration program had translocated 2,600 birds to 213 sites in 91 counties. And today, turkeys exist in all 114 counties of the state of Missouri. And there's not too many states out there that could say that turkeys exist statewide in every county. So that's kind of unique. It's a great tradition that we have in Missouri of the wild turkey.
Then to add to that, that restoration program has been so successful that, Missouri has been able to trade turkeys to other states that have low populations, to establish them there. And in some cases, it's helped us to reestablish other species. So
Absolutely.
That's been an amazing program.
Our turkeys in Missouri have gone to many points of the country. I'm positive of that. This is kind of a general map of the range of the wild turkey in North America, and it shows by color the different subspecies. So if you start down there in Florida in the kind of the orangey color, that's the Osceolas in Florida. The blue is the eastern subspecies, which is what we have here in Missouri, and what most turkey hunters will tell you is the toughest bird to hunt and the toughest bird to fool. Now, I've not hunted other subspecies, but I know how easterns can be, and you wonder how they get so smart sometimes, because they are. The red, the Rio Grande subspecies. The purple is the Merriam's. You'll notice there's some hybridization that takes place in the green areas. Down in the southwest, you have the Goulds, which is in the yellow. And then way down on the Yucatan, it's barely on that map, is the ocellated, which is a very unique bird. And one thing we want to point out, if you look most in the areas from the Mississippi River Basin east, that's pretty covered up with turkey habitat and turkeys in general. But look out west and you'll see that a lot of that suitable habitat is probably along those drainages, and you'll see a lot of that color along those rivers and streams in the west, and that's where you'll find wild turkeys out there.
There's probably no place that's more evident than in Nebraska, where you have the Platte River coming down, and the same thing. Even though it looks really widespread in Kansas, me having the opportunity to hunt both of those states, I pretty much know when you're, especially when you get out west, because we have an abundance of water here in Missouri. But when you get in some of those other subspecies, that's the first thing you look for. You find the water because there's always
Right.
trees by the water, and that's the first place you start scouting for turkeys.
The trees and the water. That's that's pretty key. We don't have to think about it. Like you said, we don't have to think about that in Missouri, but out there
Right.
you certainly do. As I was doing some research into this and to come up with this program, came across a master's thesis written by Lauren Virgo in 2016 for her work at the University of South Carolina. And it says turkey calls are a uniquely American hunting tool created to hunt a uniquely American game bird. And I didn't find any other quotes I thought was more appropriate to what we're going to talk about than that. Turkey calls are very unique. It's become an American folk art, really, and there are competitions that are held about making turkey calls and decorating turkey calls, things like that. And of course, we know the wild turkey is a very uniquely American game bird. It has a very unique and special place in our history. And I guess if left up to Benjamin Franklin, it would have been our national symbol instead of the bald eagle, is what they say. So it's very
Glad he
unique.
got outvoted.
Yeah. So we want to start with a little bit of history about turkey calls. And I suppose if you had to think back, you can imagine the very first indigenous people that were hunting turkeys and for birds in general probably made calls with their mouth, whistles and different types of calls with their mouth. But then there was a creation that was made at some point in history, and they started to put bird bones together, and in this case the turkey bones of the wing, the three bones of the wing. And we know through the archaeological record that at least in archaeological sites dated about 6500 BC, that these wing bone calls were being made, where the bones were being fit together. And so we have evidence that goes back at least that far in North America. In Europe, there are examples of bird bones from swans and vultures being used to make different types of bird calls. So turkey calling's been around a long time, and it's certainly these type of calls have been around a long time.
For people who may not know, those turkey bones, they're hollow. The centers are hollow, and that makes them work the way they do so that you can make a suction and make those sounds.
The three bones, like I said, were of the turkey wing. What we're talking about is the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. And the picture on the bottom there, it shows you how they would cut those bones. And then the picture in the top left is those bones fitted together in what looks like a modern day wing bone turkey call. And it is a suction type call. And it's not an easy call to master, and I will vouch for that. So, but it does make a turkey sound, and I'm sure with enough practice you could get good to do that. And of course, every turkey carries around two of those, so you can harvest a turkey, and you can at least create two calls from every turkey you harvest. So don't throw away those wings. And we'll talk about somebody that saved those and marketed those a little later. A little turkey call history. Went through the history books and wrote down a few dates about different patents and different types of calls that were created. And it goes back to 1867 when a patent was awarded for a mouth whistle. Later, Charles Jordan had a yelper that was marketed. There were other yelpers around at that time that were being marketed. The date that really stands out to us as turkey call enthusiasts would be January 5th of 1897, when Henry Gibson was awarded a patent for a box call, and that's the box call on the page there. It was a glued box that he marketed through a hardware store in St. Louis, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But there were other calls that were created, scratch boxes, friction slates. Another name that's going to come up a little later is the last name Searcy, R.E. Searcy. We know that he had a fence post box call from Shannon County that was dated 1912. And then other improved mouth calls and even push button callers. So gives you an idea of kind of a timeline from about the mid 1860s up until about 1949 of things that were happening in the creation and advent of turkey calls. This is a picture of that Jordan Yelper that was drawn by Tom Turpin. It was a wing bone Yelper. It used part of the turkey wing bones, and then part was made from cane. But it was also a suction type call, and those were popular in the late 1800s, and worked off of placing the end in your mouth and sucking on to make kind of a yelping sound to call wild turkeys. The first one we really want to delve into is the Gibson box. The patent was 1897. You can see a patent document here on the right, and then a picture of the actual call. Henry C. Gibson was from Dardanelle, Arkansas. He was awarded the box call patent, and it was sold through Simmons Hardware in St. Louis, Missouri. And we are certain, and get your opinion, Tony, but there were probably box calls that went way back. This was just the first person that actually patented the box call.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that there was calls that pre-existed this one. The reason we know about this one is because of the patent. There's a lot of things that we don't know about Henry Gibson. We know when he was born, but that date of his death, we don't really know that. There's been a lot of researchers that have looked and they simply cannot find, whatever happened to Henry Gibson. But what's interesting is, I mean, you think about that time frame, 1848, Henry, we know he did not have a whole lot of schooling, which very few people would have in that time frame.
Right.
But obviously, Henry was a very wise man. He had the foresight to patent that call. We also know that he farmed over 400 acres in Arkansas, which at that time would have been a lot of land. That would have been a pretty good sizable piece of land. And he also had another smaller tract that we would probably think of, as a lake house or something. And that's where he did a lot of his hunting and stuff. He had a cabin on a small tract of land where he recreated. And so Henry was a very wise man, and somehow he made it to St. Louis and got this agreement with Simmons Hardware, which was where the majority of his calls were sold. It said he probably gave a few away. They probably ended up other places. But for someone of that time frame to travel the distance he did and be successful as he did, he was, he was an entrepreneur,
Right.
in every sense of the word. Yes.
He certainly was on the ball and had probably had some business prowess to do what he did.
Yeah.
This call, it doesn't share some of the features of our modern day box calls. It does have a screw that holds the paddle to the box. There is no spring like you see on modern box calls. That was a later addition. No rubber bands or anything like this. The caller, he's using the paddle and he is making that the strike across the sidewall of that box. Unlike the modern calls that if you just a little bit of pressure and you could will almost fall across the box and make the sound. This person's having to come up with the cadence and come up with the movement of the paddle on them by themselves.
Some of my collector friends that have had the opportunity to handle those or write about those calls or see them, it's pretty much been said that that's a very crude call.
Right.
By today's standards, it is pretty inferior.
Yeah.
But back then it was pretty amazing.
It did have what's kind of unique. It did have a little hole and maybe a cork that held a piece of chalk. We know you have to chalk the lid and of the box typically, and so it held chalk. It was a glued, or it was a sawn and glued box instead of a hand hewn call like we'll look at it in a little later. But very unique turkey call, and it certainly has its place in history. And what's very unique is Gibson probably was the first person to decorate a box call. And today, decorated calls are something that we kind of take for granted. A lot of the artwork in calls is very elaborate, but back then, he definitely took this call and added some things to it, even as crude as it is. And this call was a call that was given to a friend. On one side has a log cabin and a gobbler, and it's inscribed on the right there. It says, "The time when we were boys." And then the other side has bird dogs, and the inscription is, "The age in which we live." So he's probably given this to a friend, and he's making comments about maybe things they encountered when they were kids growing up, and now maybe their hunting has advanced a little bit, and now they get to hunt over dogs. So kind of unique.
And a neat point to that follows through with a lot of the call makers that we're going to talk about is when they decorated those, it was doing the exact same thing that Henry did. They were using that art to tell a story of some kind, either about their region or about hunting. But it wasn't just random art. I mean,
Right.
that's a history book.
Yes. He actually put the gentleman's name on there. This person was from Greenville, Kentucky, and the date for that particular call. So this call is very documented, and certainly was one that Gibson put some effort and time into.
And that's another thing to talk about, Henry, there having the foresight and the knowledge that he did. One of the reasons we claim that this is the first box call aside from the patent is we can verify them from his calls.
Right.
There was a lot of call makers, even up through some of the more recent ones, who didn't sign calls, didn't number them, never thought of them as being collectible, and so you can't verify them.
Right.
And there could be calls that we've found out there that were before Henry's, but we just have no way of verifying them.
Right. This call is very well thought of, and as such, the NWTF made a recreation of the call and for their banquets and as an auction item. So a few years back, they auctioned these calls in a commemorative box and actually inscribed it on top or printed on top. Gibson Turkey Call, patented 1897, and Simmons Hardware Company is the sole agents in St. Louis, Missouri. So if you ever run across one of these, you'll know what that is. It was a commemorative call to honor Gibson and the first box call patent, and was through the NWTF auctions.
Not only have they copied it, but many other call companies have as well and issued theirs. And I believe even yourself have recreated that call.
Yeah, I did that last spring, and actually it's one of my only calls that turned out. It makes turkey sound, so it's
right.
good.
All you can ask for.
That's right. We're going to get into the 20th century and talk about two individuals whose names come up very frequently when you talk about the evolution of turkey calls, and that's Michael Leroy Lynch, or ML Lynch, and Neil Cost. And both of them made a significant impact on turkey calls and turkey call manufacturing and what that means today. So I'll let you comment on those, Tony.
Absolutely. And most from here on out, pretty much everyone we're going to talk about will be Missouri call makers. But there are a few people, and primarily these two, that you can't talk about call makers without bringing up these two names. Neil Cost is probably the most respected call maker anywhere. I mean, you mentioned Neil Cost's name, and he's just the godfather of call making. On his gravestone, it actually says Neil Gobbler Cost. And unlike unlike a lot of call makers who were just making calls, just purely for function, Neil was he was a perfectionist, I guess. He studied a lot. He worked very, very hard on, making the perfect in his mind sound. His calls they weren't just rough pieces of wood that made some sound. They made the perfect sound. And he experimented as many callers did, but he went to great lengths to get his calls perfected. Neil didn't have a whole lot of school. Again, he was born in 1923. So like most people of that age, they went to a few years of school and then started working. In Neil's case, he had 9 years of education, and then he was drafted in 1943. And Neil has quite the history serving our country. He was drafted in 43. He lost one of his eyes. He got shot in the face. And nowadays that would put someone out of the military. Their career would pretty much be done. In Neil's case, he went home, he healed up, and he ended up back in Okinawa, and took on machine gun fire, and was once again wounded, sent back home. And that time he was discharged shortly. But his recruiter came back to him in 1950 and relisted him. So Neil went back to Korea, served our country some more. There he was hit by a hand grenade. So he didn't have the best luck in the military, but he come home then. He still ended up serving in the National Guard after that, and retired from there. Went on and went to tour in Germany. So he really, he did a lot before he really started making calls. He never made his first call until 1950.
Right.
Was when he made his first call. And we're primarily going to talk a lot about box calls, but like many call makers, Neil made a lot of different styles of calls. He does have a connection with Missouri. He was hunting in Missouri in 1978, which would have been, after we had a very good established population of turkeys.
Right.
And in 1978, he was hunting down in Ellington, Missouri. And he ran into a guy by the name of Bill Rhodes. And we're not going to talk about Bill a whole lot, but Bill was a call maker himself. He also convinced some other people to start making calls in that area. But when Neil run into Bill, Neil himself told this story. He took note of the call that Bill had was an extremely long, goofy looking call. That wasn't his exact words, of course, but that's pretty much what he said. Bill was holding this, 14, 15-inch box call, and everything that Neil had done, he thought that was ridiculous. And so they ended up hunting together, and Neil used the call that he had. He was successful, got a turkey. The next day, they were still hunting together, and Bill got a turkey. So Neil decided, even though that call isn't the prettiest looking thing, it didn't sound the way any of his calls really sound, it must work. And so Neil, being the guy he was, he ended up trading a call to Bill, and he took that call home with him. A little kind of funny coincidence, but that call ended up being made by Walter Winterbaum, who we will talk about shortly. But that call sat on Neil's shelf for many years, before he took it down and tried to come up with his own version of it, recreate it. And as it happens to be, the last call that Neil made was in that style. He kind of trademarked that style as the eminent style of calls, is what he called them. And the very last call that he made, he called the Fat Lady, and he drew a picture of some crude artwork of a cartoon character on that. And that call sold in the early 2000s for like I believe it was $11,000 is what that call brought. Since then, we found out there was actually 10 of those calls. So we don't really know which one was truly the fat lady, so to speak.
Right.
There's been some argument about that. But yeah, Neil, very, very well respected. You can't talk turkey calls without talking about Neil. Moving on to Michael Lynch. Lynch was actually born well before Neil was. Mike was born in 1896. He started making calls. We can verify it back to 1940. So obviously, we figure he probably made a few before that in the late 30s or so. Probably one of the most copied call makers out there by far. People who have no idea anything about turkey calling, if they've ever seen a turkey call, it's
Right.
probably very likely they have seen a Lynch call. He was the first one who ended up, I guess, mass producing calls, selling them on a huge market at that time. The Lynch company was sold in 1970 to a gentleman by the name of Alan Jenkins. Alan estimated that at that time, Michael had probably made about 80,000 calls. And
Wow.
all of those calls were made in Birmingham, Alabama, or in Alabama. He had a office there, or a workshop, before he started marking them Birmingham. But then the company, when Alan bought it, it moved to Mississippi. It later sold, and I believe the last time it sold was somewhere around 2000, give or take a year or two either side. But when it sold, then it moved to its present day location in Georgia. And you can still go to Bass Pro, Cabela's,
Right.
Walmart, and you can still buy pretty much the exact same call that Michael Lynch started making in 1937. So that's kind of neat.
And the Lynch call is an easy call to use.
Yes.
For me,
Um,
if you pick one of those up, it's just, very little pressure to make really good
a really
sounding,
good sound, yeah.
you know.
And of course, we talk about the gobbler call, or the world champion as it's sometimes marked. But Lynch made a lot of different calls himself.
Right.
He made some slate calls. He made some single-sided calls. He made several different styles of calls, but everybody kind of knows the two-wall common
Right.
world champion call.
Right. All right. Probably wouldn't be talking about turkey calls like we are as much, except for these two guys that really brought turkey calls and put them on the map as a collector item, as artwork, and that's Earl Mickle. And we'll hear about another gentleman here in a moment. But Earl wrote 3 books: Turkey Call Makers Past and Present, copyrighted 94; Turkey Call Makers Past and Present, The Rest of the Best, 99; and Longbeard's Call Makers and Memories, 2005.
Absolutely. I mean, call collecting, it's absolutely owed to Earl. Earl spent a lot of time. He was an avid turkey hunter. I do not, as far as my knowledge goes, I don't believe Earl ever made a turkey call. He sure didn't sell any. It's possible he may have piddled it a little bit, but to my knowledge, he never made his own turkey call of any kind. But he was kind of in that heyday, the late 80s or whatever. There was a lot of birds out. He was fortunate enough he could travel and hunt a lot. He was really, really good friends with Neil Koss, and many other call makers as well. And he would hunt many states and get to know the local people, figure out who made calls.
Right.
We're not really sure what started Neil's love with turkey calls. But he wrote these books in his first book, and his first 2 books were very limited edition, and they've become quite valuable among themselves. But in his first book, he wrote about the call maker. He put a value, or a collectability, I guess, not necessarily a value, but more of a, in his opinion, how collectible he thought these calls were. And at that time, the economy was pretty good. People had money, and they started chasing some of these calls. And so a lot of these people that we're going to talk about, as well as many others, they become quite famous. Most of them without
Right.
really wanting to, but he wrote
Yeah.
those first two books, and then his final book, his third book, he actually, it was kind of the wrap up as he was getting a little bit older and health was declining a little bit. But he went to uh, every state that had turkeys. He hunted with someone from that state with a call from that state, and it's more of a storybook. Tells a little bit about his hunts as opposed primarily to call makers. But those books, as well as the next one that you talk about, I mean, they're kind of the collector Bibles, so to speak.
Right.
Um, you know,
That third book has some great color pictures in it too of different turkey calls that he
yeah,
collected. So that's great reference. The other call author about calls is Howard Harlan, who wrote at least this book, Turkey Calls: An Enduring American Folk Art. And you might talk about that, but just talk about turkey call collecting in general. And I know you have information about this next situation with a collector in North Carolina.
sure. And um, this book here, it was sort of a continuation, sort of its own thing. It took its own little variant a little bit, but it talked a lot about different areas than what Earl did. Um, and I'd mentioned earlier that call of Neil Koss bringing $11,000. That value was shortly surpassed a couple of years later when a call brought $14,000. And then later on, this gentleman by Danny Ellis, he is a real estate developer in North Carolina. Um, he purchased, which could be considered the holy grail, I guess. He purchased a Jordan Wingbone call that he stumbled across. He gave $50,000 for it. When he found it, he already had a very extenuous collection. All of his calls, Danny kind of is making a museum. I mean, all of his calls are very rare. I guess they've become high end calls. They may not be of the best quality, but they're very rare, limited calls. And when he bought this call, he was willing to go into, the full six figures to buy
Right.
this call.
Wow.
I mean, it was, we talked about the patent of Jordan's earlier, and so very, very few of these calls out there. That one was verifiable, which is a huge deal. They could prove it had history. They could prove where it had been. And so that call became very, anyone would love to have that call. And it's not uncommon at all for some of these calls that we talk about to get into the three figures. That's pretty easy to do now with the craftsmanship and stuff. These calls easily get into the three figures, some in the four figures. Once you get past that, you have to have a lot of documentation to go with the calls.
Right. Historical significance and
Yes.
some history behind it. Now we're going to get into our Missouri calls and Missouri call makers, both past and present. And this is where I know our interests are because it's a story primarily of the Ozarks. And in particular, we're going to cover a lot of information and a lot of call makers and calls that came out of Shannon County, Missouri. And we couldn't talk about Shannon County turkey calls without talking about the last name Searcy. And the first individual, his name was Robert E. Searcy of Eminence. And he made these long box calls. And the one that we know the most about was dated 1912. And it's a very unique story that goes along with it. This call has a variety of engraving and artwork and things on it, but it was given to a friend of Robert's, and that friend in the 1940s gave that call to Robert's son, who his name is Dan, or was Dan, and basically with the comment that Dan, there's no more turkeys anymore in Shannon County, and your dad made this call, and you should have it. And Dan then acquired it in the 1940s. Um, I'll let you talk a little bit about Robert and Dan and that, and then we'll get into talking a little bit about where this call went and how it was used.
Sure. That call that Robert, of course, never sold any calls. He gave a few away. It's not really known how many really made. Very, very few, we figure. The only one that we know that exists is that one there that was given back to Dan. The Sersky family, they have a lot of history in Shannon County. They moved to Shannon County somewhere in the mid 1800s from Columbia, Missouri. Uh, all of the family served the state. It seemed like in some form. Uh, Robert, he served as a elected official. Um, his brother served. Dan himself was a state representative, a tax collector, the county treasurer. So I mean that family has a lot of history serving the state.
Right.
Do you want me to go ahead and talk a little bit about Dan's calls?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe about this event in 68 that kind of kicked this thing off
Sure.
in Shannon County.
Yeah, and so 1968 was kind of a key date. If you remember a little earlier when we were talking about the restoration in the state, um, the first turkey season was in 1960, and so there was a few people that were starting to hunt turkeys. Our restoration program took place in that area, very close to there. And so 1968 was the centennial celebration of eminence. And because turkey hunting had become kind of a part of a way of life for some of those people down there, they decided to have a turkey calling contest. And so Dan pulled out his call that had been given to him by his dad, and he made a copy of it. And he entered in that contest and actually won it. And actually, a few of the other guys that we're going to talk about in some of the upcoming slides, they were in that, they'd made calls and was in that same contest as well. And we have to think that maybe in some way it's possible that one of those Gibson calls ended up in the area. We don't know that obviously, but that would be on the travel from Arkansas to St. Louis. But obviously there was some other calls around at that time besides probably just Roberts. I mean, he got the idea from somewhere, but a lot of these guys started making calls for the fact that they couldn't buy them anywhere. They wanted to hunt turkeys and they were using what they had in the area, which very common cedar.
Right.
And many of those people will find as we talk, they either worked in the timber industry of some way, shape, or fashion. So most of them had carpentry skills. If they didn't do that, they were school teachers. That was kind of the only work in that part of the country. There's some farming, but it's basically raising a little bit for your family. It's sure not on the scale in the Ozarks, even
Right.
today, that we think about in other parts of the country. I mean, timber, even today, is the major income for that part of the state.
Yes.
And so these guys were just doing what they knew. A lot of them hung out on the river, were river guides and such, and so they were doing what they knew.
Dan made about, we say he made 400 plus calls in his lifetime, and that is a picture of Dan. Many of those were just given away as gifts, probably most of his
Yeah.
life, until later years when he gained some notoriety for making these calls. But by
And
far most.
Earl was introduced to Dan when he was in the area by I would assume, I don't know this for sure, but I would assume it would have been by Sweeney Rayfield, who we'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah.
But it would be very, very likely that Sweeney might have introduced Earl to Dan. And at that same time, there was a write up. You may have seen it. in the Rural Electric, the local co-op paper about Dan.
Right.
And when that happened, Dan pretty much became famous. There become lines at his doors trying to get a hold of his calls.
Right.
And at that point, he pretty much quit selling them. You know,
Yeah.
he gave them away to friends, but these guys were never in it to make money. That's not why they were doing this. And a lot of them gave away a lot more calls than they ever sold.
Certainly.
Yeah.
This is one of Dan's calls in your collection.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we lost Dan. He passed last year. You know, those calls they've always been very hard to find because, as you mentioned, there's just not a lot of them. But just absolutely works of art. You know, nowadays we see something like that and we think, well, someone had a CNC machine and laser etched it, and, you know, their computer made all that. Well, these calls were made by hand. You know, all of that artwork on those calls, which took these guys in some cases 40, 80 hours. Some of us very, very finely detailed. All of that was rough. You know, it was done by hand. They would sketch out something with pencil or just go to work. And a lot of them ended up with huge piles of what they considered junk because it didn't meet their standards. And so, yeah, a lot of Dan's calls. Mine, the handle up there happens to have it's carved in an arrowhead. You can't quite see that,
Okay.
but the handle of the paddle up there is actually an arrowhead. Looks like it's nipped out there. And he did a lot of pictures of deer on his, a lot of dogwoods, course turkeys, pictures of the river, of cabins. Again, they were a history of the area.
And that's, of course, the box is a one-piece box, hewn out or hollowed out,
Yep.
and then a paddle, but not a glued call. This is a one-piece
Right, and
box
all of
call.
these calls are much longer than our traditional box call that we might see today.
Right. The next person is Walt Winterbottom, Shannon County resident, born on the Jacks Fork. Spent his retirement years making turkey calls, and many of his calls scraped just with a old pocket knife. And much of what we know today about Walt's calls comes from his stepson, who we'll talk about, is James Chilton.
Yeah, and Walt, he never sold a call at all. He made some and again gave them away to friends. Very few calls, so his calls are quite prized. He some of them were signed, many of them were not, but he put some artwork on many of them. He was a carpenter again. He was a sheriff. Served on the river, guiding canoers and fishers in the early years down there. The thing about Walter is, if you noticed on the picture on the previous side, he was very well dressed, and everybody talked about how clean cut he always was. He was quite the storyteller. He liked to joke, tell stories. He was born in 1912, and so that was right prior to the Great Depression, and that made up it obviously had a significant impact on his life. Everybody that knew Walt knew they always had a big wad of cash in his hand. He paid everything in cash. He didn't trust the banks. He didn't trust the banking system, which probably had to do with him surviving the Great Depression. But yeah, he would have been a neat guy to sit on a stump and tell stories with.
Oh,
No
absolutely.
doubt.
Absolutely.
Any man that smokes a pipe in his hand, tells good stories.
Made at least 100 calls, and most were given away. And then his stepson James carried on in his tradition and that call making style, and that's who's up next.
Yeah,
James of Birch Tree, and stepson of Walt Winterbottom. Made calls of Walt's style. He began in that heyday, that mid 80s, about 1985, and also decorated calls, a lot of different turkey motifs, and looks like dogwood and deer and things. And what's neat is that his wife, Veda, decorated his calls with a number 8 penny nail, heated up, wood burned in the call, I believe.
Yeah, his calls, they were, very rough, not finished a lot. He did it strictly to honor Walt. Um, he never started hunting himself until his late 40s. He was about retired. He was a school teacher, a principal. He had a short stint with some newspaper down there. He worked for the Conservation Commission and the Forestry Division for a little bit, and then he was encouraged to start making calls, and so he started making calls in Walt style, strictly to honor Walt. He tried to do it the same way Walt did, carving them out with a pocket knife. And then his wife Veda, she would heat up a 8 penny nail and use that as a wood burning. And most of the calls have that gobbler head on the lid, and generally some dogwood blooms on the side walls. Some of them are painted, not a lot. But James didn't sell very many calls. He was very reluctant to sell calls because he did not want there to be more demand than what he could make. He said that would take the joy out of it and the reason he did it.
Yeah,
You know,
sure.
so
You mentioned Sweeney Rayfield earlier. Also, he built or made these Shannon County long box calls. Started making his calls about the same time, and I believe he was probably in that
he
same group
was.
that was
Yep.
involved in that turkey calling contest in '68.
Yeah, he absolutely was. And Walter Winterbaum was actually in that contest as well. I mean,
Yeah,
all of these guys knew each other. I mean, it's a small world down there, you know.
right.
They were all friends. Everybody knew everybody, you know. Sweeney was another one like Walt. Quite the character. Um, and the Rayfield family was, they were pretty. I don't know if you would necessarily say big, but there were several of the Rayfields in the area down there. Still is some of their descendants in that area, but uh, a lot of them ran dogs. They had fox dogs. Never killed foxes. They weren't hunting them to kill them. It was purely for the chase, to hear the dogs.
Okay.
Um, so they weren't hunting them for the hides or whatever. They were just hunting them for the sport, I guess you could say. um, Sweeney was a school teacher, and he met Neil at some point when Neil came up there. Ended up furnishing Neil with a lot of Southeast Missouri Jacks Fork River walnut to make
Mm-hmm.
calls out of. Neil decided that the density, the structure of the grain was very good for making calls, so he furnished him some of that. We know that Earl came and met Sweeney, and Sweeney knew everybody down there, and it seems like Sweeney was very instrumental with lots of visitors that come to the area to introduce them to these people, who, some of them you might not just walk up to their door and knock on it. That might not be the wise thing to do. But if you come with Sweeney, it was okay. If you're with him, you must be
You,
an all
you,
right type of
you're a
guy.
good guy.
Yeah. And I mentioned Sweeney he was a school teacher. He started teaching in 1935. There's pretty good story about how he became a school teacher. We talked about, in that area, everybody was pretty much in the timber. They were carpenters or they were school teachers. Well, Sweeney decided he wanted to be a school teacher, and I believe according to him, during that time frame in the mid 30s, there was 44 or 45 one-room country schools in the county, in Shannon County down there. And pretty much the only way you got one of those school teacher jobs was to know someone. It was almost a political election, so to speak. And when Sweeney decided he wanted to be a school teacher, there was another guy who also wanted it, who happened to know someone who was on the council, which today we would think of that as being the school board.
Right.
And so they decided that the only way Sweeney was going to get a teaching position was to get someone on the council that would vote him in. And so Sweeney had a horse, and he basically started campaigning for one of his buddies that was running for the council, and he could cover a lot of ground on this horse. And as he was out campaigning and stuff, they knew that, you know, it was going to be a pretty close race because neither one of the guys was disliked at all. And Sweeney was way back in the woods talking to this logger who was making ties. You know, he had been logging and shaving out ties. And Sweeney talked to him and said, you know, boy, I sure need you to come to town tomorrow and vote, you know. And this guy was like, I make $1.50 a day. I've got, you know, 7, 8 children, whatever it was. There was no way he was giving up a day's worth of wages to go to town and vote. And somehow Sweeney had $1.50 in his pocket. And he pulled it out and gave it to the guy. And the guy said, well, I'll sure go to town. I'd lots rather go vote than make ties, you know. So the guy went to town to vote. Well, then he actually ended up being named as chairman or moderator of the council. So Sweeney thought he'd completely wasted his $1.50, but when the vote come in, it was tied. And so this guy ended up breaking the tie, and Sweeney ended up becoming a school teacher.
The $1.50 paid off.
$1.50, yeah. Today that might be investigated.
Right. One thing, this top call here on the slide, that you have some history. That's your call in your collection, and that's
that is.
Might mention how you came across that.
We talked about, you know, a lot of these guys, they had, you know, their little woodworking shop or whatever, and they would, you know, they would make lots of parts. You know, they would make lids and paddles and match them together and so on and so forth. And this call I actually acquired. I have the history and the proof of it. It came out of Sweeney's estate after he passed. This was one that was setting up on a wood shelf that he either did not like the way it sounded rough or just hadn't got around to finishing it. But it is a rough call, and you can still make out some of the pencil marks around it because he hadn't sanded it down. He hadn't finished it yet and done those final steps to make it a finished call. And so I acquired that call somewhat early in my call collecting career, I guess you could say. But that call actually made it to Illinois. A gentleman from Illinois had some connections to Sweeney and was at his estate auction and bought a lot of calls that were there, and it came back. So, yeah.
Neat story. Decorated, looks like, with a lot of leaves and acorns and
yeah, all of
fashion.
These guys have their own little thing that can kind of be their trademark or whatever. You know, whether it be dogwood leaves, whether it be, you know, the deer, the turkey scenes, how they make those scenes. A lot of Sweeney's calls had oak leaves and acorns on them.
Right.
And they used various woods. If you get into the collecting, even what wood a call is made from, not only does it affect its sound and usability, but, you know, it also affects the value of it when you talk about some of these older calls. Right. And we have to understand all of these calls, when they were built, they weren't built as collection items. They were built to be taken to the woods and to hunt turkeys.
Functional
Absolutely.
Tool. Absolutely. Cecil Fry, also of Eminence, began in the early 70s, but he made those fence post type box calls and also made a lynch type box call. Was influenced by some of those earlier makers in Shannon County, used a variety of woods on his calls. And what was unique in Cecil's creations was he actually named or standardized different types of calls he was making. He made a small one called the baby, a medium-sized one called a junior, and then the standard one was the larger one. Sure. A lot of his is a little different than he was using fence posts and barbed wire. And like you said, a lot of those artists, they have their own unique little things. Well, his was fence posts and barbed wire, which is kind of unique.
Yep, that was his thing, and he started out with the standard edition of the call, which was the long boat paddle type of call, and then in his later years, he made the smaller ones. He made some single-sided calls and some other variants as well. when he was a carpenter again, and when he started making calls, you know, Winterbottom and those guys kind of influenced him on how to make them and probably helped him out. But he decided as a carpenter he had enough knowledge that he could make a call cheaper and he could buy one, which you couldn't find many calls to buy anywhere at that time. And so
Correct.
again, making a call so that he could go turkey hunt.
Right. Very good. And then the individual that both you and I have spoken to and know, David Ferguson, is down there in the Eminence area, and David is also currently making these long cedar fence post box calls, and got a lot of mentorship, no doubt, from Dan Searcy while he was alive. And I'll tell you, David makes a heck of a call. I didn't really know the connections, but I actually work with his son, and at the time I didn't know the connection, and his son is BJ, and BJ came out and he said, "Hey, I got to show you this call my dad made." And of course, I'd been talking to David on the phone, and I didn't put two and two together. And I said, "Sure, I'll look at your call," you know. And he comes out with this awesome box call, and I hit it a couple times. I'm like, "Gosh, BJ, this is awesome." I said, "Does your dad sell these?" And oh yeah, he gets this for them and sells them all. Very popular. And then I'm like, "Wait a minute, who's your dad?" And it was David.
Yeah,
So I got a kick out of that. But you can tell us a
yeah.
little bit about David for sure.
David, he's kind of you know, he was very very good friends with Dan. They hunted together a lot. Um, a little bit of an age difference there, probably not quite a full generation, but there is some. So that kind of puts David into, you know, the second round, I guess, so to speak, of eminence call makers. There's probably no one who's currently in that area or who has been in that area that is left that knows more history than what David does. You know, he again knew a lot of those guys, been in that area all of his life. You know, just absorbed that. And he's kind of a walk encyclopedia. You know, honors the traditions very very well, which obviously comes from, you know, spending so much time with Dan. Um,
Right, right,
you know, long before this was ever a thing. They were, you know, hunting together and telling stories. And so he's kind of the next generation that's coming, or the second generation, so to speak. We're actually almost sort of getting to that. We'll talk about here a little while later, but we're almost coming into a third generation now. You know, but that's just like our hunting traditions are passed down, these call making traditions are passed down as well. You know, that's part of life down there. And like you said, David makes an amazing call. A long, long line of waiting if you wanted to get one of these calls.
right.
Um, to approach him and get one, unless you're just really, really good buddies, it probably ain't happening. You know, I don't know how long his list is, but it's a very long, several year list.
I'm quite impressed. I called down there to talk to him, and I got a hold of his wife. And this was last year, right prior to turkey season. And she said, "Well, you know, he might not be home for a couple of weeks." And that kind of threw me for a loop. He's out at turkey camp. And these guys go out, and they may be 3 weeks. I mean, it begins before the season and goes through the season. So they'll go out and camp in the woods and hunt turkeys and probably catch fish and hunt mushrooms and all kinds of stuff, I can imagine. But he it's taken very serious in that area, and he's making quite a call. Is
Absolutely.
recognized for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Those guys go, they do, they have places where they go. You know, we hear about people going out west to camp to hunt for elk or whatever. Well, those guys, they don't really leave home, but they go just somewhere, and
Right.
it's a yearly tradition. You
Yes.
know, we think a lot about, you know, people quail hunting on Thanksgiving afternoon or whatever. Well, down there, it's turkey hunting. And I
Yes.
mean, that's, you know, you were probably the same way. We may not have had a camp or whatever, but that's the first thing I really remember hunting. I cut my teeth turkey hunting. You
Hmm.
know, may have went squirrel hunting a time or two, but turkey hunting's that's what started it all.
Right. Yeah, for me, exactly. Turkey hunting, well before, being successful deer hunting. I can tell you that. And you mentioned that third generation, and this individual is kind of would fall into that category, and he's down in that same neck of the woods.
Yep, absolutely. James lives there at Solo, which is right outside of Houston. Again, another carpenter. He's made he had a career outside of carpentry, but he definitely has made some money in his life being a carpenter, making different things. And he made some calls several years ago, just kind of for fun, something to do in his shop. Um, let's see if I can make one or whatever. And so then he got making a few and became pretty good at it. And a lot of his early calls were to my knowledge, they were the slate type calls with some kind of striker in some way, shape, or form. Um, and I actually visited with him and probably taking way too much credit. But I told him, if you want to make calls, you need to go down to Eminence and you need to look up Dave Ferguson, and learn, because when he and I were talking, we were talking a lot about history of the area, so on and so forth. And sure enough, he went down, and him and Dave have become very good friends. I think they've spent several afternoons sitting on the porch telling lies, carving on calls,
Right.
and Dave's been very willing, like he is anybody, to pass on those traditions. And this call you see kind of on the right hand side of the screen there, that would be one of his more recent calls. That again, it very much honors the tradition down there. Longer than your normal box call. It's a fence post eminent style call with wood burning made out of cedar. So yeah, he would be kind of the third generation coming along now. And
And
there's a lot of call makers that we aren't even talking about. That area is just historically so full of guys that we're making calls to hunt with.
sure.
We're just touching on the basis of them.
Right. And they're like Tony said, other call makers, Gerald Crawford, Matt Kraft, and Dan Corbin. Um, there's just a whole host of folks. It would be impossible probably to list everybody.
It would be.
Yeah.
And these are just the ones that we know of, that have documentation, that have some history. There's no doubt some amazing guys down there who, you know, may have not made but 20 calls, but made absolutely amazing calls that we don't even know about.
Right.
You've got Doug Conway down there, um, Clarence Huffman, lots of other guys in that area.
So a few years ago, the Twin Pines Education Center there at Winona put on display some turkey calls, and I think Dave Ferguson had a lot to do with that.
He did.
But they put out a little pamphlet on those calls, and a lot of this next information came from that pamphlet. And so you can actually go to Twin Pines and look at these calls, and so I jotted down just the information from them on what they have there in the center, and the names Bud Fry, kind of the same lineage as some of these other early makers. Fishing guide on the current Jacks Fork River, made box calls. John Spurgeon made a lot of his calls in the 1990s, but each featured a map of Shannon County. In one of those previous pictures we had, that there was one of his calls there with an outline of Shannon County. And oftentimes he included a phrase, "where turkeys come from," on the call, referencing Shannon County. Just very unique. Francis Jake McCormick learned from his father, started making calls in the 1950s. He made a variety of calls: wing bones, terrapin slates, double-sided box calls. But he was known for both painting and wood burning on calls. Making true artwork out of them. You mentioned Doug Conway. Started making calls in the early 1970s. Was a carpenter, and knew and worked with most likely Cecil Fry and Walt Winterbottom, and started making Eminence long box calls a little later. Alex Spike Chilton made his first call in 1968. He was a veteran, served in World War II. Also worked as a guide in that area and worked for the post office as well. William Bill Rogers was kind of unique. He served as their conservation agent in Shannon County, down there for the Conservation Commission for over 30 years. Made one-piece box calls. His artwork was a little different. It lists black-capped chickadees and hummingbirds on either side, and a gobbler on the paddle. And you see a lot of them have gobblers on the paddle, but that was the only one I saw that mentioned other types of birds on there. Jack Burris, award-winning box call artist and word carver by trade. Won some awards, including National Wood Carvers Competition. And you mentioned Jack actually has a studio or a shop there in Eminence where he sells his wood carvings.
He does. Yep, still there where he sells his wood carvings. Very, very nationwide. He would be known much more for his wood carvings than his turkey calls.
Right.
But you can imagine his turkey calls are unique and very exquisite.
Right. Clarence Huffman made calls prior to 1975. They were unnumbered, and one comment in the materials was if they didn't suit his ear, they landed in the kindling box. I reckon a lot of these guys, that's probably what happened. If they weren't satisfied with it, if it didn't meet their standards, then it was going to start the fire in the shop one morning, probably.
Absolutely.
Victor Allen Roy Crisco started making calls in the early 60s. Were prototypes for Clarence Huffman, and then his are numbered and sold, had been sold commercially at one time. And now we're going to get into some other calls. We're going to move out beyond Shannon County and the Deep Ozarks, and we're going to talk about some other call makers in other parts of the state, both past and present. And you're going to see some examples of some very unique types of calls, some kind of ingenious ways of making turkey sounds. And we would be remiss if we didn't start with Pete Pulley first, because Pete Pulley's crank call is one of the craziest looking things in the turkey call world.
It is. Pete, he actually ran a gas station down there, and he made several versions of this call before it got to what he felt was perfected. He actually started making these calls, as you can see on the slide there, in the 50s. So this was before there was even a turkey season,
right?
Which is kind of interesting. But he made about, not a lot of these calls, but then he sold the license to the Olt Company, which was out of Illinois. Very, very well known for making duck calls through that Mississippi Flyway area. In the day, Olt was, they were a mail order catalog company, kind of like Sears and Roebuck or whatever, of the hunting world. Olt made, they made deer calls, they made squirrel calls, they made quail whistles. I mean, any game that was hunted, they pretty much had some kind of call for it. And they licensed his crank call and made about 4,000 copies of it before that company went out of business or was bought up by someone else. A few years later, after they went out of business, Pete started making calls again and made, about 1,500 calls or so after that, up into, a lot of them were made early 2000s, late 90s, about that time frame. He made some very unique calls. We know of this one because it was so successful, but he made some box calls. He made lots of weird calls. He made one that was called the Sidewinder, which was sort of a box, but the lid slid like as a C, and it was chalk, so it was kind of unique. Probably the neatest call that I liked that he made. He had a slate call that looked like a giant white oak acorn. I mean, it was this big, and you pulled that cap off, and the slate was underneath it, and then the peg for the striker was in the cap.
Wow.
But he experimented, and I can imagine that he was just a very fun guy. You know, he wasn't scared to try new things.
Exactly. Exactly. Orland Kelling from Bay, Missouri, made his first call in the early 70s. He is noted for inlaying material in the paddle of a box call, as well as some double soundboards, triple and even quadruple soundboards. But what stands out is that putting that slate in the paddle. He actually won some contests in his day, and I've run into some folks that purchase calls from him, and so they're kind of prolific around in this mid Missouri area where we're located at. People are familiar with that one, but a neat call, and no doubt very unique and worthy of inclusion in our discussion.
Absolutely. Some of his calls actually, you can see in that picture there that it's got the slate inlaid. And as you mentioned, that's kind of a thing of his, but some of his calls actually have 4 soundboards on one side that are very thin wood and separated with a gap. He would cut apart like ink pen springs or something, and those different boards would separate to make a sound. And so he played with a lot of that, different things, experimenting too.
Yeah.
Pretty unique calls. And what's notable there is he lists Ray I, which we haven't talked about yet, but he lists Michael Lynch, and then Ike Ashby.
And all those Ike Ashby and Ray I will definitely hit on those guys, because both those gentlemen were key to turkey call culture in Missouri and in the Ozarks. Bobby Ray, you've got a couple Bobby Ray calls. You got some kind of a unique story with him and his calls. What I find unique about this is he's done some relief carving in his box call. And
yeah, both of those calls are there actually in my collection. I guess you could say that round slate call's actually in my oldest daughter's collection. That's her call. But Bobby, again, carpenter, carpenter by trade. Bobby's also a rodeo cowboy. He spent some time in the rodeo, but just talent beyond belief. And I've talked to Bobby a lot personally, but I can't honestly say who talked him into making turkey calls. I don't guess I've ever asked him. But not only does he have that turkey feather relief there, but some of his calls also have a oak leaf relieved in them.
Okay.
And that Bobby didn't start making calls until probably about 2001, somewhere around in there. The very first call that he really made actually ended up on eBay. And I tried very, very hard to get a hold of that call. And you have to realize this was when call collecting was just booming. And even though no one knew who this guy was, you can look at that call and tell that this guy's got talent.
Right.
And so that call got out of my price range for someone who had never been heard of real fast. And so I contacted him after the eBay auction was over. And I'm like, we talked about his call a little bit, and I got to know him a little bit and ended up commissioning a call from him. But to make a long story short, that little slate call down on the end, when my oldest daughter was born, she ended up sick in the hospital. And when we got home from the hospital, there was a box laying on my doorstep, and it had this call. And you can't tell from that picture, but there's a baby fawn wood burnt into that call. And it's got my daughter's name and birthday on it. And there was a handwritten letter in this box that said this was a call that I hunted with my daughter with. And she got a turkey with it. And he said, I understand your daughter's been having some difficult times. He said, I hope that this can one day be hers and you can kill turkeys with her. And that just speaks not only for Bobby, but for all of these guys. I mean, that's the kind of people that these guys are.
Right.
That they're just genuine, wonderful human beings.
Salt of the earth. That's an awesome
Absolutely.
gesture. Awesome gesture. Now, Ike Ashby is a name a lot of folks will recognize. Ike is a Missouri call maker. When I knew Ike, he was headquartered in Houston. Prior to that, he'd been making calls in Vienna, but Ike was a conservation agent. And so Ike's moves around went along with his moves as a conservation agent. And he started making his first sawn and glued box calls in the 1960s. He actually sold them in some local grocery stores. And when I was growing up in the early to mid 80s, he was actually selling calls that were through Walmart stores. And so you could go into Walmart in Houston, Missouri, and buy a variety of Ashby calls that were made right there in town, which was very unique because at that time there, it was something new coming along. The turkey's population was now booming, and a lot of folks were coming in and learning how to turkey hunt and had use of calls. You see a variety of calls there. He made box calls, slate calls. I would say his box call style was like that Lynch call in that style. He did make a one-sided hen, what's called a hen box call, and that's probably the most sought after of his box calls. But he started out, if you can find those calls, I think we're talking about this, Tony, if you can find the calls that were marked Vienna, those are the older calls and probably more sought after than the ones in Houston. But prolific call maker, sold calls all over. And both Tony and I could probably tell you some stories. I'll let him tell some Ike Ashby stories first.
Absolutely. And Ike made we have just a small sampling of the calls that Ike made there. I mean, he made a lot of different sizes slate calls. He made a push button call that I don't believe we have there. The owl hooters, the box calls, some scratch type calls, wing bone calls, and by far, as Brian said, if you're into call collecting, anything marked Vienna is more valuable. There was a lot of calls made in Houston, and anybody from that area has some kind of Ike Ashby story. One of Ike's calls was actually the very first turkey call that I ever had. And Ike, after he had retired from a conservation agent, he used to probably somewhat to promote his calls, but also because he did make wing bones, you had to come up with those wing bones somehow. And anybody who's hunted turkeys for very long might remember the old check-in stations for deer and turkeys, and you'd harvest your turkey and then you'd have to go check it in. And Ike would sit at the check-in station at Houston. And Brian, you actually said you remember him being inside. I remember him being kicked out and sitting in the parking lot, but still allowed to be there. But when you would come out, he would ask you what you were going to do with those turkey wings. And, most people were going to throw them in the ditch. You can't eat the bone and the feathers that's on that wing. And so he would offer to trade you product for those wings. He'd have a back of his truck there or whatever. He'd have a box of just different styles of calls he made and let you pick something out, and he'd take your wings. And so the very first turkey call I ever remember acquiring was from trading Ike some wings. And you mentioned that he sold them in the Walmart. A lot of these local call makers, they sold them at the local country stores or the hardware stores around and stuff. And that's how a lot of them did get started. You talked about him being an agent. I'll let you tell the story about him on patrol.
Yeah, absolutely. What your comment was that you said that he would talk about there may have been more people that had killed more turkeys than him, but not as many people had called in turkeys like he had. And I remember the comment, I believe he made it, that he had made turkeys gobble in every month of the year. And a lot of that was just probably he was on patrol and he was out where the turkeys were, probably watching for folks fishing and hunting and violating the conservation laws, the wildlife code, and he was out in the woods calling turkeys a lot of times out there on patrol. I would probably credit Ike with getting me interested really in turkey hunting, because I didn't come from a family of turkey hunters. I'm sure both my grandfathers were hunters, and I'm sure they killed turkeys, but I wouldn't call them that they weren't really turkey hunters. It was probably just that the turkey, you had an opportunity to take a turkey. They just didn't go out seeking turkeys like what we do today and calling them and things like that. But Ike, being a conservation agent, he was coming to schools and giving turkey programs. I can remember him speaking to an auditorium full of kids in elementary or middle school there in Houston, and making turkey sounds and really making it interesting for kids at that time. And like you, I can remember, trading turkey wings for products and things like that, and just being surrounded by that, knowing him and in that situation, and being able to buy these calls and go out and be successful because the turkey flock was so good at that time. It was kind of the perfect storm of things that happened at that location at that time that kicked off my love of turkey hunting. So I'd put a lot of that on him.
Absolutely. And he was doing a lot of the things that you and I were doing when we met long before it was cool,
Right,
talking to kids, to young people that had no knowledge of
right.
the sport of hunting, and just sharing that. And he had a way, he was opinionated but charismatic. And he could capture your attention and tell those stories and get you interested.
And I think he was also one of the first ones that carried camera out and was making some videos, turkey hunting videos. And a lot of folks might not know that, but and I wasn't able to come up with any clips or anything, but I know those did exist at one time where they were out filming hunts. So
Yeah, and you and I had talked about this earlier. We're not sure which one of the two would truly be credited for doing it first, but there's a couple of other guys that were um, probably more instrumental in the commercial side of the
right,
hunting industry that both came from Missouri, and one of them was definitely probably the first to make turkey hunting videos.
right, absolutely. Got a couple other pictures of Ashby calls there. Go back to that one there. He made of, like I said, just a variety of calls. I mean,
Yeah,
everything from scratch boxes to you know,
made
box
a lot of
calls,
mouth calls,
everything, mouth,
diaphragm calls. Yeah.
absolutely mouth calls. So just a lot of different types of calls. Wing bones. We talked about wing bones earlier. Wing bones are one of those calls, as are the yelpers there seen in that slide. That artists and turkey call makers, they get some interesting artwork on, as small as they are, and they can get pretty creative in how they present that. And Ross Page and Roy Wilson, you had a couple examples of those wing bones. I've been making some wing bones lately, and I've got one here I'll share with you. I don't know if you can see that one there. This one, I wanted to make one that looked kind of old, and so I've kind of decorated this one up. It's got a piece of turkey beard on it, maybe for good luck, but I can almost see some kind of early hunter carrying something like this, and and I have an interest in history, and so that's my contribution to the wing bone making.
Yeah, most of the wing bone calls, if you remember back at the very start of our presentation talking about the Jordan pattern, they
Yeah,
pretty much all still follow that. Three pieces. There is some guys that will make some out of two, and of course that makes a little different sound. A lot of those can be used in the fall to make fall turkey sounds, kikis and such.
right,
And guys are actually a little bit picky about the bones and stuff that they use, because the different diameter of the hollow core of that turkey bone or the river cane or whatever they're using, it does produce a different sound. And so the hen bones that have a much smaller diameter are probably a little more desirable, because they make a better sound. You're not pulling in too much air. Some guys have even played with, I think you had talked about earlier, in some of the other countries, some of the artifacts we had found of being of other bones, but we see a
Right.
lot of call makers use goose bones, out of those. And I happen to have one here. If you can see that, it's actually the two ends are wing bones, and then the center is actually the leg bone with the turkey spur. And the call maker hollowed this out, and this was actually my daughter's first turkey. That was the bones and the leg off of it. So pretty neat keepsake to have, and those, when you make those calls, and you've made some, I've played with some of them, but very easy, very fun thing to do with, to commemorate your trophy of a turkey. The collar you see on some of them is fly tying thread. And so they will epoxy those joints and then run different color thread on it. They may scrimshaw, they may use a marker, paint on it just to decorate up, and then they clear epoxy it so that it stays the same color, preserves it.
Right. Yeah, I shared one of my calls with the gentleman that was with me when I killed the bird. Made one for him, and like I said, it's a great way to share a part of that experience. I hunted with a young man last youth season, took him out, called in a bird for him, and made a call for him to commemorate that bird. So that's just like we keep the tail fan and the beard typically and the spurs as trophies of a wild turkey, you can also make a call and relive some of that. On this slide, we're talking about pot calls. We've got a couple different individuals represented, but the calls on the slide there on the far right part, be remiss if we didn't mention our good buddy Vince Vector from Vector Custom Calls up Northwest Missouri, and we've used these calls. I know we have, several of our friends have very good calls. You might explain, why is it called a pot call, and the different surface materials or scratch materials that are involved in that?
Sure. Generally we call those slate calls. And that's because a lot of the early ones they were slate. They can be called, pot calls, scratch calls, different things. But the general consensus behind all of these calls is there is some piece that has a soundboard or a slate of surface glued to it. And I say some piece because everything we see here is wood, but we have a lot of them in history that might be turtle shells. They could be a bone or a horn. There's some of them. You can use anything that makes a hollow cavity. And you see on the bottom of those, then they have holes, and that allows the sound to come out. And you have the surface that you use some kind of striking material. Generally, it's wood. It can be acrylic. It can be fiberglass. It can be a carbon tube. It can be the end of a wing bone. These, can work to basically you're scratching and causing vibrations because of the friction between your striker and your surface. Slate, of course, is the most common. You have glass, you have ceramic. Those are probably the three that you see a lot, and they just all have different hardness. The striker, whether it be a piece of wood or whatever, different types of wood, different wood grains, different hardness of materials produces different sounds when you're using these calls. And usually nowadays with the current ones, you'll actually have a second surface underneath the surface that you actually play, and that surface kind of magnifies the sound, and it makes it loud enough so you can actually hunt with it. And depending on they may be the same surface, they may be different materials. Depending on those materials, the type of wood, all that plays into the tone that call makes.
I'm running a Vector ceramic call this season, but I'm running it with a Ashby Striker, little ode to history. But I've not used a ceramic type call yet in my hunting career, so I've very interested to try it this season, and I've been doing that. But I also like that he puts that slate on the other side, so if I want to run that, I can. And it's a good sounding call. You can hit both sides of that, and I use this exclusively to harvest my first bird the first week. So
Yeah, and
uh,
what's neat about that ceramic and some of those surfaces is, you know, a lot of times when you're out hunting, it may be wet or there may be a dew on, and the water doesn't affect them the way it does
right,
slate. But
right,
what's important to remember about those slate calls, especially the slate ones themselves, is you have to keep the oils of your fingers and stuff off of that surface because it relies on friction. So anything that, you know, reduces that friction, messes with the sound of it a lot.
be careful how you put it in your pocket. If you're going to put it in your pocket and it's a slate call, don't put the slate towards your
Yeah.
body, because of the perspiration. It'll shut you down in a heartbeat. Unless you, the secret then is little talcum powder or something to dry that out, and then you can get back in business. But
Probably the easiest style of call there is to learn on,
yes,
other than a push button call, which you just don't see any anymore hardly. But that slate call, the pot call, probably the easiest, most common beginner call to get a really a sound that will call a turkey.
absolutely, absolutely. All right, Tony, we're wrapping this thing up. Our parting shot's going to be just your number one turkey advice. What would you tell folks as they go out this spring? Of course, we're at the end of the second week, starting the third week here coming up. There's still a chance to get out there. What advice do you give new turkey hunters?
Probably the biggest advice I could give is patience. You know, turkeys, they may just have a brain the size of a pea, but boy, sometimes they can be awful smart for being so dumb. You know, and we all, like we talked about with our early hunts, we mentioned, you know, we all have that dream. We see it on the videos that turkey's up in the tree and it flies right down to us. We shoot it and we're back in town before, you know, 8:30 having coffee. Well, that's not the way it typically works. You know, we're competing with real live girlfriends.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
You know, and so I would say probably my number one tip is to be patient and don't call too much. We talked about the different subspecies of turkeys and stuff, and some different subspecies react differently, but the easterns are very much known for being overcalled, and they know every inch of the woods that they live in. And if you're sitting by a tree for 3 hours, calling every 5 minutes with that pretty new call that you bought down at the Bass Pro Shop, not moving, well, that's not natural. And the gobblers sure know that. If you call early in the morning a little bit and, you know, listen to what the turkeys are doing, but you're
Right,
trying to make them curious. So be patient.
right. Um, absolutely. I mean, that's real good advice. Stick with it. None of us went out and were successful right off the bat. That just doesn't happen typically. We went. It's through trial and error that you learn how to do this. It's not just go out and first time take a turkey. Typically, that's not how it goes. But stick with it. Adapt to what the turkeys are doing, and know spend enough time in the field and scouting your locations to know where those turkeys want to be at certain times a day. You'll see that they'll favor certain types of areas in certain types of weather. They'll favor certain types of areas. So do your scouting and your homework ahead of time. And I'll just leave you with, you know, everybody talks about, oh, I don't have a place to hunt and it's hard now. It's you know, can't get any permission and things like that. Our state has millions and millions of acres of public land, and I almost exclusively hunt birds on public land, and I'm successful at it. But it takes scouting and it takes time to get in there and find out what's going on. But get out there and explore our public lands, and they're just awesome to enjoy and to get out and to hunt on. So there's opportunity out there, and certainly we'd welcome new hunters to the ranks and new turkey hunters for sure.
Yeah, before you finally just completely close it out, Brian, I'd add, you know, there is. We both hunt a lot on public ground. It is a lot more challenging. It is a lot harder. but it is extremely rewarding when everything finally comes together. But like you say, this is the best time of the whole year possibly to be in the
Right.
woods. You know, you may not be successful getting that turkey, but while you're out there, look at everything that's going on. You know, you have red buds, you have wild sweet William blooming, you know, so many wildflowers out there, so many birds doing their mating rituals and stuff. And it's just a beautiful time to experience the woods.
There, turkey hunting is one of those things that you interact intimately with the animal you're trying to fool and to seek out. And so if you enjoy that interaction and enjoy seeing everything that's going on at the time, this time of the year, this is going to be an activity for you. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Tony for being our resident expert on our turkey calls and turkey call makers in Missouri. And I wish you luck in getting out and enjoying Missouri's outdoors and turkey hunting. So thank you very much.